The death toll from a Russian missile attack on a residential building in Ukraine's northeastern city of Sumy has risen to 11. The strike also left 89 people injured, including 11 children. Rescue teams are working at the scene of the attack to assess the damage and search for survivors. The attack follows another major attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure on Sunday. The casualty figures we're now learning are more than 10. Power has been knocked out in most of the cities hit by the Russian attacks. At least 10 people were killed in the Odessa region, while 40 more others were injured. In Kherson, 4 people were killed and 10 others injured. Blasts rang out across the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, and other cities as Russia staged its biggest missile attack since August and targeted power facilities with the winter setting in. Energy Minister German Galushenko said on Facebook, "Another massive attack on the power system is underway. The enemy is attacking electricity generation and transmission facilities throughout Ukraine." Air defenses could be seen engaging drones over the capital in the night, and a series of power blasts rang out across the city center as the missile attack was underway in the morning. Russia launched around 120 missiles and 90 drones in a massive combined airstrike on the country's energy infrastructure. Kyiv residents sought shelter in the underground metro stations while incoming missiles were being intercepted over the capital. Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha described the strike as Moscow's true response to leaders who had interacted with President Vladimir Putin, an apparent swipe at German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who placed a phone call to the Russian leader on Friday for the first time since the late 2022. 2 women were killed in Ukraine's Mykolaiv and 6 people were injured in the Russian drone attack. Another 2 people were killed in the Odessa region following Russia's attack on the region's energy infrastructure. Local emergency services released video footage showing firefighters hosing down flames in residential neighborhoods. Later, residents were seen queuing for water at public water supply points and flocking to invincibility points, which give people the opportunity to warm up, get hot food and drinks, and charge their mobile phones. Russia's defense ministry reported it had hit all its targets, saying its attack was on essential energy infrastructure supporting the Ukrainian military-industrial complex. Now, hours after that attack, sources said the U.S. President Joe Biden gave the green light for Ukraine to use long-range missiles to hit targets inside Russia. U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner had refused to confirm if this really is President Biden's decision, saying only the United States has repeatedly said it would respond to the deployment of North Korean forces in Kursk. The move means Ukraine will now be able to strike targets inside Russia, most likely at first around the Kursk region, where Ukrainian forces hold over 1,000 square kilometers of territory. While Poland and the EU have welcomed the decision, Germany says it will not be providing long-range missiles to Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's reaction to the news: he says such decisions are not usually announced, indicating the missiles will speak for themselves. In his words, strikes are not carried out with words, almost confirming that he has received the go-ahead from the U.S. government to deploy those U.S. long-range missiles. Sources familiar with the issue say the decision reveals a significant reversal of Washington's policy in the Ukraine-Russia conflict early on Sunday. The decision, though, made after Russia's attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, is understood as a direct response to North Korean troops fighting alongside Russian forces in this war. President Zelensky has also visited troops in Povrovsk, a logistics town on the front line of the conflict. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has responded to the supposed decision by the U.S. state's government. Government spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says this move means a new round of escalation of tensions if the decision has indeed been made and conveyed to the Kyiv regime. He says it's obvious the Biden administration intends to take steps to add fuel to fire and provoke further escalations, and that Moscow will view the attacks not from Ukraine, but from the United States itself. In his words, it is not about allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It's about making a decision about whether NATO countries are directly involved in the military conflict or not. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing less than the direct participation of NATO countries, the United States and European countries in the war in Ukraine. Speaking of the European Union, Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell has reiterated his stance to allow Ukraine use those Western weapons strikes deep into Russia. France, which has provided long-range missiles to Ukraine, has also signaled allowing Kyiv to strike military targets inside Russia, which remains on the table.
I've been saying once and again that Ukraine should be able to use the arm we provided to them in order to not only to stop the arrow, but also to be able to hit the Arcas. I continue believing this is what has to be done. I'm sure it will be discussed once again. I hope member states will agree on that, and if not, anyone will do whatever they believe is according with the need to support Ukraine.
Minister, please, about Georgia, please.
Zo, morgen. Ja, kijk, ik denk dat dit een adequate respons is ook op de Noord-Koreaanse troepenpresentie nu aan Russische zijde. Dus het is echt een goede reactie daarop. Wat ik wel jammer vind is dat dit nu al naar buiten is gekomen. Liever had ik gehad dat het een verrassingseffect voor de Russen was geweest.
Let's bring in now the VOA's Anna Chernikova to speak some more about this. Anna, it is great to see you as always. The U.S. government is refusing to confirm or deny that President Biden has given the go-ahead, and the Ukrainian president as well. He's refusing to confirm or deny. He says, when we see the missiles, we'll know what decision has been made. So what should we believe, Anna? Will Ukraine consider using those long-range U.S. missiles on Russian targets?
Good evening. Well, it looks like Ukraine is preparing to use the missiles, and it looks like that this information is actually the realistic one, let's put it this way. I don't think that we should expect any official confirmations, but as you have already demonstrated the speech by President Zelensky, his reaction, he said that and actually, he did not comment any further on that. So it was the only comment that he gave on Sunday evening that there are a lot of talks around, but we will see the actual the actual results and the actual talk would be done by the missile. So this is what he said, and I think that this is basically was kind of a confirmation. Of course, we cannot take it as a direct confirmation, but it was a hint by President Zelensky that we should expect certain missile attacks happening sometime soon, or sooner or later, and we will just have to wait and see, and just to get the confirmation of this green light when the first attacks and the first missile strikes are happening.
Yeah, I can imagine there's very little out there in the news to grapple with. But this decision has gotten European partners all riled up, because what they say will determine, of course, where they stand in this. Is it concerning to Ukraine, Ukraine as it considers these responses? Is it heartbreaking, whatever their stance may be, especially for countries like Germany and France? Germany refusing to allow Ukraine to use those long-range weapons, and then France saying that yes, it will continue with that kind of support for Ukraine.
Well, at this point, it's difficult to say something and to actually comment on the reaction, because Ukraine is actually expecting and reportedly information from the local news, from French and UK news, is coming that reportedly France and UK will also follow the US decision and will also allow Ukraine to use their long-range missiles on the same conditions, apparently, that US. But again, no confirmations, neither direct or indirect, are here at this point. In Ukraine, there is expectation that it should be the case that UK and France would actually follow the U.S. Decision and will take similar decision. However, of course, for Ukrainians, the reaction inside the country, definitely this is an extremely positive. It's something that it's a very long-awaited decision by the U.S. But a lot of Ukrainians, however, said that it's actually quite a little too late, and meaning that it's not bad or it's not something that will not, create difference. Of course it will, but of course Ukrainians were really hoping to get it sooner. And here is basically the answer to the question. If there is no decision by other countries, well, then it just no decision and it changes nothing. If it is a decision, it would be another great positive news and a little relief for many that actually Ukraine is getting more chances and more possibilities to actually change the situation on the battlefield. So according to what's discussed at this point, it is expected that France and UK will also join the club of the long-range missiles green light. In terms of Germany, it was confirmed by the Minister of Defense of Germany that Germany will provide Ukraine with a new artificial intelligence generated drones, which are called mini Taurus, referring to the Taurus long-range missiles. So the drones are also quite good long-range weapon. But yeah, long-range missiles from Germany at this point, at least, were not under the discussion.
Pretty interesting, isn't it? Let's talk about the attacks that happened yesterday. Energy infrastructure was the main target all across Ukraine. I know of attacks in Kyiv, in Odessa, and a few other places. Ukraine obviously has been expecting these kinds of attacks. So how much of an impact did they have on energy distribution?
Yeah, so on Sunday, it was really one of the probably largest attacks, not just since August, but just in general on the energy infrastructure. One of the biggest, because in total there were 210 both missiles and drones used, which is quite a lot. Also, some ballistic and hypersonic missiles were used, particularly in Kyiv, and some of those, when they are shut down, if they are shut down, it's a very specific sound, and I personally have heard a couple of explosions like that in the middle of the night in Kyiv, and it was basically also confirmed by the air defense. So Ukrainian air defense managed to destroy 120 targets, but there is quite a big damage to the energy infrastructure, as Minister of Energy of Ukraine confirmed and said that situation is difficult, and basically what we see from the areas where the damage was confirmed, it's basically the regions where the main energy distribution systems and facilities are located. So we can understand at this point that Russian forces were trying to hit as much of the distribution points and distribution infrastructure as possible. From Monday, so today, as we're talking, Ukraine is back to the electricity emergency shortages and There is, again, back a timetable, as we already discussed with you previously in previous years, that Ukrainians now have, all Ukrainians are basically following the timetable of electricity shortages and plan their lives according to this timetable as when the and according to the timetable, there is electricity provided to Ukrainian citizens. And we will see for how long. Maybe from today on, it will be the reality for the next months of winter.
That does sound kind of tough, Anna. At the time of these attacks, it was not clear the number of casualties. We're picking here and there figures that were readily available as of yesterday. So what is the official figure of casualties from these attacks?
So over the night, the attacks that was happening on mainly on the energy infrastructure, at this point, there is confirmation of at least 7 people killed and thousands injured. If I'm not mistaken, again, but I'm pretty sure it's like 5 or 7 that were confirmed killed. The biggest amount of casualties, however, was later in the day, in the evening, when Russian forces conducted a second attack, which was targeting mainly the city of Sumy, and there were a couple of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles involved. And one of the missiles hit energy infrastructure as well, creating a lot of troubles in terms of energy system. But another one hit residential building directly. And unfortunately, at this point, the confirmed amount of casualties, so there are at least 11 people killed and 89 injured. 11 people of those injured remain in the in quite bad condition, so 11 killed, including 2 children, and 6 children remain in the reanimation in a difficult condition. And more than 500 people were evacuated from the buildings, because it's like a neighborhood area with a lot of apartment buildings. So people basically don't have a place to stay at this point. Over 500 people. And another attack, similar attack, actually happened in Odessa today, in the early afternoon. And at this point, also, we have confirmation of at least 10 people killed and 47 injured, but the rescue operation in Odessa is still ongoing.
Anna, thanks again for bringing us up to speed. Do stay safe in Kyiv.
Thank you.
We're staying with the war in Ukraine. Former U.S. ambassador to Georgia, now currently ambassador in residence at Northwestern University, Ian Kelly, says the decision by President Joe Biden to allow Ukraine to use U.S.-made weapons to strike deep into Russia is unlikely, he says, to change the war's overall trajectory, but could help Ukraine at a moment when Russian forces are making gains and possibly put Kyiv in a better negotiating position when and if ceasefire talks happen. Before now, despite Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's pleas, the White House has been reluctant to allow U.S.-supplied weapons to be used to strike targets deep inside Russia for fear that this could ratchet up the conflict. Russian President Vladimir Putin has long warned the West not to allow U.S. weapons to be fired deep inside Russia, but Kelly said he believes Putin is unlikely to attack the U.S. directly in a military manner.
I think it's a signal to the Russians that the United States is not going to pull out, if that's the right way to put it, that we are going to continue to support Ukraine. The Republicans, who are taking over both houses of Congress, have leading Republicans have long said that we should remove these restrictions. So here you have the Democratic administration doing something that the Republicans have asked for, and so I think it's a signal that we're gonna continue to support Ukraine. I think that this development, the addition of foreign troops on the ground, is demanded some sort of response. And I find it interesting that Biden made this decision at a meeting of the Asian Pacific, at APEC, Asian Pacific Economic Council, I guess it is, because the South Koreans and the Japanese are looking at this and seeing a real broader threat. If North Korea is sending ground troops, gaining valuable experience, possibly gaining some new game-changing technology in terms of ballistics for North Korean missiles, it's obviously going to be very threatening to the Japanese and particularly the South Koreans.
Security expert Chidi Warner joins us now. He's in London. Chidi, thank you for joining us on the program today. Now, there have been a lot of reactions worldwide regarding this decision by the Biden administration. Why do you think the U.S. president is giving Ukraine the go-ahead now, just 2 months before President-elect Donald Trump is sworn into office?
Good evening, and thank you for having me. I think there's several factors that we have to take into account. The first is the purely operational, which is the Ukrainians currently are, I hate to use the phrase winning or losing, but they are currently on the back foot, are being pushed back not only in the east of Ukraine, but they're facing an imminent counteroffensive in the Kursk salient, which they created within Russia. Now, the big problem they have with that is that the Russians are not only using their specialist troops, their paratroopers, they've also allegedly brought in North Korean troops to participate in this attack. This gives the Russians not just a qualitative advantage in terms of they're using their good quality troops, but a quantitative advantage in terms of the North Koreans. We can't assess the quality of the North Korean troops yet, but they could be a good factor that would at least allow the Russians to continue their tactic of, pummeling the Ukrainians until they fall back. The importance of the Kursk salient to the Ukrainians is not only does it divert a lot of attention of the Russians from their fighting in the east, but it's also a good negotiating piece for the Ukrainians if and when we get to the negotiating table. So that coming back to the Biden decision, the loosening of the restrictions on the use of American long-range weapons gives the Ukrainians the opportunity to break up this counterattack or defeat elements of this counterattack, destroy air support and destroy its troop concentrations, logistic concentrations before they're able to strike the Ukrainians. So it gives them a little bit of if not an advantage, it gives them a bit of leveling of the playing field for this coming offensive. And it creates dilemmas for the Russians because they either need to call off their offensive or they need to factor in they'll take a lot of losses or divert more resources to defend these troops, more air defense, more electronic warfare assets to defend these troops who are massing for this counterattack. At the strategic level, you've clearly got a very interesting dynamic in that Biden is a lame-duck president after his only term in office, is about to hand over to his arch-rival, as it were. But Trump is also a lame-duck president in that he can only run for one term. He's got, while he might currently have both houses of the U.S. Congress and Senate, and he's won his presidential election, there's a limit to how much he's going to do. I mean, he's made the boast that he will come to bring this conflict to an end, within a day. It's a very difficult thing to do. So what Biden is, the only kind of view we could have is that strategically, Biden is either trying to strengthen the hand of Trump by making Ukraine, deliver him a victory just before he takes office. Or if you want to be very Machiavellian, he's complicating Trump's hands by creating conditions whereby the Russians will look to escalate and Biden will be forced to either commit further U.S. resources to support Ukraine or leave Ukraine hanging and pull out, which will be a dent to his prestige.
Well, we can't tell now, can we? We'll have to wait a few months to figure that out. But Russia said very few words about this. They're not ones to give empty threats. The government spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, says the U.S. will be pouring fuel to fire. That's clearly saying the conflict in Ukraine could escalate and could be a lot worse. Knowing Russia, what do you think are her options in this regard?
Oh, the problem Russia has is it has very limited options, and there's two elements that one must look at when you're trying to assess the Russian reaction. One is the official statements. Now, the official statements, unfortunately, we can't read that much into because they're given to very hyperbolic threats, nuclear tsunamis, and burning the cities of Europe, or Europe will freeze, and etc. And it's turned out that they've not been able to carry through many of those threats. But if you look at Russian Telegram channels, Russian social media, and see the chatter there, there is an element of concern and also confusion, not just concern, but confusion, and exactly the same question as to what is Biden playing at. Is he about to push this war, to an extent that Russia can't handle, or is he just trying to cause, a mess for his successor to take over? But Russia's options in terms of retaliation are relatively limited. It's already in a state of total war with Ukraine. There's not much more it can do to Ukraine. It's already started sabotage operations within Europe, so it could escalate these. It could increase its length and breadth, the targets. It could start destroying, critical infrastructure like, transatlantic fiber optic cables, things like that. It could maybe go an even greater step and start attacking, attacking the border crossings with NATO countries. But all of these things, all these escalations lead to counter-escalations. If you attack critical national infrastructure, there will be a retaliation against Russian infrastructure. If you attack a NATO country or a NATO border crossing, there will be a counter-attack onto Russia. So Russia's options are relatively limited. I think they're most likely going to try and look at the grey zone. So looking at sabotage, looking at disinformation, misinformation, but direct kind of tit-for-tat response, there's not much more they can do.
Or Russia could carry out its threat of using nuclear weapons against Ukraine. And also the Russian government says if Ukraine does use those long-range missiles, it will consider that those missiles are coming directly from the United States. Do you think that Russia will go on an all-out conflict with the U.S.?
Well, I don't think that Russia would risk using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The problem with nuclear weapons is once you use them, it's very difficult for all the other nuclear states, be it the US, UK, France, China, whoever it is, to know who exactly it is you're targeting, and they have a very limited timescale with which to make that decision. An attack on Ukraine, even if it's very clear that it was just a limited attack in Ukraine with nuclear weapons, will trigger a response from the United States, especially if it happens under the Biden era. And especially as we've just discussed, as Biden is a lame duck president, he has absolutely nothing to lose if by a massive retaliatory strike against Russia if they try and use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So I'm not too worried about the nuclear option. In terms of Russia's kind of vitriolic statements about retaliation, they said the same thing when HIMARS were deployed to Ukraine, the same thing about F-16, the same things about Western tanks, the same things about just about any weapon system that the West has sent to Ukraine. Russia has declared that this is a red line and there'll be massive retaliation. They've not done it. One day they may retaliate as they claim, but it's not a threat that one takes seriously at this point.
Maybe they should, because Russia was talking about this. I mean, its invasion of Ukraine until it eventually invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. But walk us through, will you, some of the responses by some of the countries in Europe. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying, though he supports Ukraine, will not be providing more weapons, will not be providing those long-range missiles. France and the EU say they will continue their military support for Ukraine, and they will also be providing those long-range missiles. What are you reading into some of these reactions?
So, I mean, first, just, in terms of, Russia's build-up to the invasion of Ukraine, the difference here is that in the build-up to the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was very clear that it was not planning to invade Ukraine, and then did the opposite. So, again, if we're trying to read, this is why I say it's always a little bit reductive to try and read Russia's intentions from its official statements, because it never actually follows through in a linear path. One has to look around into the shadows to see what Russia is really saying. But in terms of Europe's support, I mean, you've hit on a very important point. Irrespective of what Biden does or what Trump does, it's very clear that this is a European war and Europe needs to step up. There have been some serious conversations going on within European capitals about how Europe is going to, keep funding the war. There's still a lot of wishful thinking that, the Americans may come through, or Trump may change his mind. But most serious analysts at this point understand that this is a European war, and Europe needs to either fund this war for Ukraine to fight or be prepared to fight it itself. And there are many preparations going on throughout Europe, getting European militaries ready to fight. The Germans have done a very comprehensive review of their armed forces, and they're regenerating, heavy divisions, armored divisions, mechanized and light divisions ready to fight again in Central Europe. The Polish are obviously the world leaders in this, and they've regenerated a huge army based on their historical conflicts with Russia. They are quite prepared to fight the Russians. The Swedes, the Finns, the other Baltic states, again, have all prepared themselves, not just for a fight with Russia, but for fighting and resisting and taking back their territory. The biggest problem is in Western Europe, where these countries have not been able to generate the same amount of capabilities as the Eastern countries, the Northern countries. But these are the biggest economies in Europe that can fund this. There are so many issues in regards to, obviously, just building up the capabilities, rebuilding, their forces. Some things as basic as, just training areas, here in the UK, it's quite difficult to book training areas just to get soldiers trained up. There's many structural issues that need to be resolved, and they're still being resolved in all Western European countries at a peacetime kind of level, rather than being looked at as, one is in an imminent, could possibly be in a war within a year or 2 years. So this is a fundamental problem within Europe. Things are happening, but they're not happening fast or as desperately enough as they need to.
Yeah, and I'd spoken earlier about the U.S. President-elect Donald Trump, who said that when he's sworn in, the war between Ukraine and Russia will end, even though he doesn't say how. We've had a bit of Trump experience back in 2016. So what do you think could be Trump's strategy for Ukraine?
Well, Trump has two options, and I've described this as being between Kabul and being between Mosul. So if you look at Mosul, in 2016, the US and, Iraqi forces were fighting against Islamic State in Mosul. And in the middle of that fight, it was a transition from Obama to Trump. Now, Obama's team, not Obama himself, but Obama's team had developed a fairly straightforward strategy of how they were going to take the city. When Trump took office, he didn't change anything about it. He loosened some restrictions, and obviously Mosul was captured. ISIS was eventually defeated. Trump took the credit, everybody went home and was happy. So when I say the Mosul option, Trump has the option of turning around and just reinforcing, doing everything that Biden is doing, maybe doing it a little bit more aggressively, so that Ukraine fights as hard as it can and gets in the best position to negotiate its way out of this conflict. That's one option. The second option is the Kabul option. Now, when Trump was leaving office, he negotiated a peace deal with the Taliban. This peace deal cuts down the number of U.S. troops, stopped U.S. air support, and gave a rigid timeline, and also released a huge number of Taliban prisoners back into the battlefield. So this option is, would be if we applied it to the Ukraine situation. And again, the most important point is the Afghan government wasn't represented at these peace talks. So if we apply this to the Ukrainian situation, this could be Trump now forcing the Ukrainians to accept a peace deal in which the Russians get everything they want, as the Taliban did, cutting off support the same way that he cut off support to the Afghan government, and imposing a peace deal that leads to a Ukrainian collapse. Either which way, the war will end the same way, the Afghan war ended with the Taliban victory. But it would obviously not be in the Ukrainians' favor. So there is a whole shade of variables between both of those positions, but I think it's going to be one shade of each.
Really interesting perspective. So if there is the possibility of an escalation of this conflict to whatever degree there is, what would be the impact on countries in Africa where Ukraine has a commitment to supply grains?
So this is the key question that, especially we in Nigeria need to be looking at, is the second and third order effects of this war. We've already seen the impact on, world food supplies. But there's also other impacts. I mean, if Ukraine is defeated and, Russia takes over, the territory that's taken over. I mean, Russia will just ship the weapons, and it just means we'll ship the, agricultural produce, and we'll just be buying grain from Russia. I mean, it doesn't really change much. It just gives Russia that kind of advantage. The question is, if this war continues and it expands, Russia has a lot of issues in terms of demographic issues. A lot of its workforce is being sucked up into this war or into the military industry, meaning that Russia's own agricultural kind of sector is struggling. It normally traditionally relies on migrant labor coming in from Central Asia, but a lot of them have stopped coming in because they're afraid of being conscripted into Russian forces, and also because of a lot of anti-migrant sentiment in Russia. So there's a possibility of food insecurity within Russia itself. The same will apply in Ukraine. Ukraine is struggling for manpower. It has deliberately decided not to recruit young men, leaving them in the workforce, and also, rather kind of cynically allowing them to create, more children. But at some point, it's going to have to recruit them, taking them out of the workforce, creating, again, food insecurity, and then sucking a huge amount of produce out of the world market. What this means for Africa is that what's left on the market is going to be bought up by those with the biggest wallets, which is clearly not the African countries. So there'll be higher food prices. And if Russia continues, weaponizing, energy, potentially higher energy prices, so increasing the food insecurity in Africa. The second element is in terms of weapons, military equipment. Russia was a huge supplier of military equipment, to African states. Now that it's in this war, it's unable to service and supply more equipment or even provide ammunition because it's using a huge amount by itself. What this means for African states is that a lot of them have weapon systems that they can't service, they can't sustain because the original suppliers are not able to provide that support again. So for many countries now, they're looking at rearming themselves, but rearming themselves with either Western weapons or Chinese weapons, where at least they can guarantee that they'll still get a supply, irrespective of whatever happens in Russia. This, again, it comes at a huge cost. So those countries, for example, like Sudan, Ethiopia, which are involved in huge conflicts, this is coming as a huge expense to them in order to have to rearm and retool themselves or source weapons from different from different sources. So the effects on Africa of this war are quite profound. But what we're going to be seeing, I think, as the biggest effect is the collapse of what we would describe as a rules-based order. Now, in Africa, we've obviously had a lot of issues with conflict and abuses of human rights. But what we've seen from Russia, the Ukraine war, and more recently the Israel-Gaza conflict is that a lot of the things that we consider to be basic human rights, the law of armed conflict, no longer seem to apply. And what that means for us is that our conflicts in Africa are most likely going to become much more brutal, much more violent. Institutions like the ICC, which have had a limited role in holding, African dictators or African warlords to account, are completely discredited now. So there will be no kind of remedy for any of these things going further, and it's something that I think African policymakers need to look into.
Well, thank you so much, Chidi. This has been really comprehensive. Thank you for joining us on The World Today.
Thank you for having me.
A Russian delegation led by National Resources and Ecology Minister Alexander Kosylyov has arrived in Pyongyang for trade and economy talks. State media, the KRT, earlier today aired a short video of the Russian delegation being greeted by their North Korean counterparts in Pyongyang International Airport. The report came amid international criticism over rapidly developing military cooperation between North Korea and Russia. US, South Korea, and Ukraine have said there are more than 10,000 North Korean soldiers in Russia to support its war against Ukraine. Some of them have been engaged in combat in Kursk near the Ukraine border.